When you have somebody with a gunshot wound or a stab wound, especially to the torso, they need a surgeon. They need a surgical evaluation, and they need it rapidly. Do what you have to do on scene and get moving.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Monday Afternoon Journal Club Magic Monday here on the Overrun. Ed Bowder and Dan Schwester bringing you some of the newest information that EMS has to offer. And today we are going to talk about a study that came out of Boston in November of 2023. This is Death by the Minute, Inequities in Trauma Care. And what these guys did, and this is a great paper. Again, this is November 2023. But what they did here was they did an analysis of gunshot wounds in the city of Boston. They looked at over 4,500 shootings, 758 deaths, and they looked at how transport times affect the care of these patients, and had some pretty interesting results, not the least of which was a little bit of medical racism. And we're going to talk about that today. So, Danny, a little bit, right? So, Danny, we got this study here. They wanted to compare how they did and how they did compared to other cities. And Boston is not necessarily known for gun violence, but they're certainly known for violence a little bit, I guess. I mean, anyone that's gone to a Celtics game or a Bruins game in the postseason certainly understands that. But let's talk about what we found in this paper here, Dan.
Yeah, very interesting. They did a retrospective analysis, and they found that they found some disparities in care, especially along racial and socioeconomic lines, which is really, really interesting, and potentially something we need to take a serious look at.
Something I think is really interesting in this paper here, as you can see in the map on the screen, they show the trauma centers as it relates to the city of Boston. And it also shows where the actual shootings took place. These white dots that you can kind of see here were fatal shootings. The dark dots here were non-fatal shootings. So the first thing is I did live in Massachusetts for a hot second of my life, and I want to give a shout out to my friends in Southie who have the longest response times in the city. But yeah, so here we have survivors, 3,787 survivors, 758 non-survivors. Median age is not surprisingly very young, 24, 25, not surprisingly predominantly male. They have breakdowns here of race, Black non-Hispanic, Black Hispanic, white non-Hispanic. What I thought was interesting, about a third of the shootings were multi-victim shootings. The median predicted time to a trauma center for survivors was 9 minutes. Non-survivors was 10.5 minutes. That's about 90 seconds. I don't know that I want to hang my hat on that just yet. I think it does sort of stand to reason that the longer your transport time to a hospital, especially to a trauma center, is, the lower your outcomes are going to be. I think this is another sort of confirmatory paper. And again, if you look at the map here, you see everyone on the south side here. You see more white dots kind of interspersed through here. Again, I don't know that it's super surprising that in the area of 20 and 25-minute transports, we have increased mortality. But I do think one of the interesting outcomes here was they did find a fairly significant difference in race, broadly speaking, which is to say that people of color had worse outcomes and longer transport times than non-people of color, white people. And that might be a function of the neighborhoods that these traumas are in, but I do think it's important to mention because we are going to see racial disparities in outcomes regardless of what systems we're in. But it is something that's very well worth mentioning. So
yeah, I think when we get into it, when we look at these things, we do have to look at these disparities and see what the reasons for the disparities are, right? It could be it could just be because of the neighborhood. It could just be because of the location, but there could be other factors at play here, and that can affect how we take care of people.
Absolutely. And their conclusion here, greater transport times to a level in trauma center are associated with higher mortality for victims of firearm violence. There were modest disparities among transport times between different racial and ethnic groups. These findings can be used to guide similar study in other cities and support local and national policies focused on developing trauma systems. So again, stuff that we all like in these studies. The implication is that there's further research to be done, which is something that we look at in every study we talk about. But they do mention that there are some subtle differences in race, which I think is fascinating. Again, I don't know if that's a town thing or if that's a city or if that's unrecognized bias. There's a lot of causes for that. And we don't really have the time or the data to do causal analysis here. But it is interesting that we kind of have this as confirmatory evidence where people that have been shot and any penetrating trauma, I guess, the solution to these patients, hot lights, cold steel. Right. These are patients that they need to get to a trauma center. And in cities like Boston, If you're familiar with metropolitan layouts at all, in the city of New York, for example, New York City is a grid where if you're at, X and Y and you need to get to Y and X, it's 6 up and 4 over, however the math works out. And cities like Philadelphia are kind of similar to that. Boston is not a city that's laid out in a grid. Boston is very much laid out the way it was in the 17th century. So it's not an easy city to navigate. And there's other logistic conversations that might have to go into that. Are there places where these patients can fly? Is there a reasonable way to actually get them to a trauma center faster? Because if all of your trauma centers are in the north part of a city and all of your calls are in the south part of the city, you're just not going to have the outcomes you're looking for.
No, absolutely. And that's something that I would like to, I mean, hopefully we'll see the social scientists and, um, more people take a look at this and look at it from a causal analysis and really kind of decide, hey, do we need, what does the city need? What does the resources demand? And how can we make that happen? Um, I do like that, I hate the idea of scoop and run versus stay and play, but this does back up with further data in a different direction that shows, listen, don't fool around with penetrating trauma. When you have somebody with a gunshot wound or a stab wound, especially to the torso, they need a surgeon. They need a surgical evaluation and they need it rapidly. Do what you have to do on scene and get moving. And if you're hanging out trying to put an IV in, you're not helping the thing. You're not helping the situation. Go to the hospital.
You couldn't be more right. And in these situations, I think that in some instances we're kind of told, like, get the IV, get the access, get them to the hospital. If you're not working in a system that isn't offering whole blood or even blood product, you're just not going to increase these patients' survival, because in trauma, we know what's lost is blood. What saves lives is blood. And that's really kind of where the bottom line is. And even here on the chart, you can see that this is a scatter plot and it shows the mortality and predicted trauma. And it's just down here, we have predicted transport times in minutes. So as you're looking at this, you can see that there's kind of this exponential growth in mortality as time goes on, which is not wholly unexpected, right? If you only have 6 units of blood to lose and you lose 4 of them in 10 minutes, then you're not going to have any blood circulating. And that's where your problem lies. So as far as the systems improvement is concerned here, we know there's really no quick way to increase transport times, especially in a city like Boston, right? There's just, there's X amount of cars and there's Y amounts of streets. And that's pretty much in every urban environment that you're going to see. So situations where you have these patients that are losing this type of blood, this amount of blood, maybe something as simple as putting whole blood onto the ambulance is actually going to improve their outcomes. And failing that, a stop the bleed kit, maybe we're looking at a bundle that needs TXA. And we're recording this not really knowing the armamentarium that Boston EMS has. But they are one of the more progressive and more popular EMS systems in the country. So we would want them to have more, available and progressive systems and tools. So I have this patient. I know that my response time is going to be extended. The stuff that's going to help them stop the bleed kits, TXA and various transfusions. So this might be a system that could benefit from whole blood on all of their ambulances or whole blood in fly cars or however it's going to get out to them. And I think that that's something that we really need to kind of consider in these settings.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not going to build a trauma center where the injuries are happening, right, then you need to figure out a way to delay the dying process long enough to get to the surgeon. And the data that we're seeing from other cities that bring in whole blood and other interventions like this are really promising. And it sounds like this could be a thing. This definitely could be a thing for Boston. I know that they do kind of run a tiered system. Their paramedic units are pretty up to speed from what I've heard. This might be a marriage made in heaven.
And Boston MedFlight, again, is one of the premier flight systems that are in this country. We have no actual commercial interest in them. They're just a well-run system. And it occurs to me that in a system like that, and I don't know where their aircraft are stationed, so this certainly isn't a criticism. It's more just reading the study and just kind of spitballing what might be available. It might be a setting where if there's more fatal shootings in the south end of the city, maybe it's beneficial to have a helipad that's in the south end of the city, right? Or south end of the city, to have a little bit more access to these patients. Maybe there's a systemic change that can be made to try and make a little bit of adjustment to improve these transport times. What I do think is interesting too in the data set, they do, and we've talked about this a couple times already, they do mention the racial disparities. I do want to take a minute to talk about that because I think that it's probably something we don't pay enough attention to, and it's certainly that it's something that needs to be brought up in conversation. So in this study, the disparities in race were about a minute and a half. I don't think that that's indicative of any sort of deep medical racism. That's not to say that there might not be some involved. It's just I don't think that that is a systemic problem. But I do think that the data is interesting. Where again, is there a predominantly people of color population in the South, and that's why there's a disproportionate amount of them affected, or the areas near the trauma center, is it a more white neighborhood? These are all questions that we need to ask. And if we are seeing those disparities, and we've talked at length about clinical treatment and whatever, and even talking to Tristan Glenn about DEI and how this all factors into medicine, it is something that we have to notice. It's something we have to appreciate. It's something we have to talk about, because while these differences might not be too extensive, it is the seed of a problem that could grow into a bigger thing as time goes on.
Sure, definitely. It's statistically significant enough that it warrants its own study. If we notice there's a difference that's this much, next question is why, and how do we address that? Is it something that we can fix too? There may be a reason for this disparity that is completely benign and almost like nothing you can do about it. On the other hand, if we want to take care of all the people we serve, we have to look at this.
And again, this isn't to say that all of Boston is a racist town and blah, blah, blah.
No.
That's not the accusation at all. We're not doing a Dennis Leary bit here, but it is this disparity exists whether it's intentional or unintentional. So it's something that needs to be addressed and something that needs to be spoken about. Again, as far as the treatment is concerned from this paper, stop the bleed, whole blood tourniquets. We all know what fixes penetrating trauma out in the field, packing wounds and all that kind of stuff. And it could lead to a further, I think it's interesting conversation about how we do CPR in penetrating traumas. Is it worth it to actually do compressions to speed the flow of blood around the body, to actually speed up the bleeding? There's a lot of different elements of that we can talk about, but it seems to me that the biggest problem that Boston needs to find right now is the why. Right. We know that this is what should follow every good data set, right? We know what the data says. We know that increased transport times also increase mortality, and certainly they're going to increase morbidity as well. So now that we know we have this problem, what sort of solutions do we have to offer, and how do we actually start to implement them? And that's where that systemic change can start to happen. And again, we've talked about this before, Danny. The first step into solving a problem is admitting that there is one.
Absolutely.
So if your first problem now in Boston is that we have increased transport times and increased mortality, and we know there's a racial disparity, maybe we start talking about how do we decrease our response times.
Yeah,
right?
and to their credit, they're looking at it. How many other cities have this and haven't even examined it? So I take it as a positive. I take it as a very creditable study to take a look at this and try to understand why, so that everybody gets a fair shot at surviving an injury.
And I think that's the most important part, right? We're never going to get 100% survival. That's not what the goal is here. That it's, you can never achieve perfection. But again, we've talked about the risk of, losing the good in pursuit of the perfect, where in a setting like this, you can take the time and take the data that you found and actually really have an honest moment with yourself and with the system. Are we providing the services that we intend to provide? And are we doing it in a manner that's consistent with our values and with the values of the city? How are we actually growing with the city? And, you want to try and take an active resistance to the 100 years of tradition unimpeded by progress that we see in our industry so much. But really interesting stuff. We're interested to know what you guys think. Is your system actually showing increased mortality with response times? Let us know. Check us out on EMS One. Check all of our stuff out on YouTube, as well as our podcast. And for the Monday Afternoon Journal Club, I am Ed Bowder. He's Dan Schwester. Like and subscribe, and the button down below, and we'll talk to you all next week.